Trujillo, Spain. In the early 16th century, two boys grew up here dreaming of gold and conquest. They came from two great Trujillo families, the Orellanas and the Pizarros. But when they left Spain for the New World, they became deadly enemies in one of the epic dramas of history, the search for El Dorado. This is the old route from the Pacific up to Quito in Ecuador. In the 1530s and 40s, it was traveled by adventurers and conquistadors, all hoping for riches beyond their dreams.
Even at the time, there were those among the Spanish conquerors who realized the immense historical significance of the fall of the New World. These are the greatest events, wrote one of them, since the beginning of the world. And the most cataclysmic of them took place in just a few years. 1520s, the fall of the Aztecs, and then the fall of Peru in the 1530s. And then the story shifts here to Ecuador, as thousands of Europeans flood into the continent, seeking new lands of gold.
Among them was a Spanish captain called Francisco Orellana. A veteran of the Inca Wars, Orellana was to be the hero of one of the most amazing journeys of exploration. Early in 1541, he came here to Quito. The old northern capital of the Incas, Quito was now a Spanish frontier town. Orellana had come to find his cousin, the new governor, Gonzalo Pizarro. Handsome and cruel, Gonzalo was in his early 30s now, the greatest warrior in the New World. But Gonzalo was a man whose greed had not been satisfied even by the gold of the Incas. Only 4 years after the fall of Peru, Pizarro was dreaming of new conquests. From the rooftops of his palace in Quito, he could see the Andes rising to the east. Early in 1541, a rumor began to sweep the city that beyond the mountains there lay a land richer than Mexico or even Peru. A land of gold. The ruler of this land was said to be so rich that he covered himself in gold dust every day and washed it off each evening. He was the Golden Man, El Dorado. I was fascinated, said Pizarro, and I determined to discover that land and to conquer it. And we set out to follow him. We took an expedition doctor with us, John Colley.
It's above 10,000 that you get altitude sickness, potentially. So where are we at now?
Yeah, we're coming up to 12,000 feet here.
Wow.
All through these campaigns, they had to operate at high altitude. They developed this kind of cotton, thick, quilted cotton armor for fighting in the tropics. But of course, you're dead on the equator here.
Yeah.
But you come up to this altitude and you're well, in serious trouble.
Sure.
I think.
Beyond the peaks, they entered a drenched green world with streams and waterfalls which eventually become the Amazon. They might as well have been wanderers on the surface of an alien planet. Pizarro's route has never been traced on the ground. We know that for the first few months he explored in a vast circle eastwards. But when his cousin Orellana joined him, they set off from their camp near Baiza northwards to the river Coca.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus Christ. How many people did Pizarro bring down here?
It's quite slippery here. Be careful.
The horse is with us.
Hello.
Yep. Good.
How many people did he have with him?
220 conquistadors. 4,000 native bearers. Yeah. 200 horses, hundreds of hunting dogs, hundreds of llamas, carry deer. Incredible.
To Pizarro's alarm, his vast army of native bearers was rapidly wasting away.
Spanish had 4,000 native bearers with them from the highlands, but they all died by the time they reached the plains. The history books say it's just that there were highland people who came down here and couldn't cope. Why should 4,000 die, do you think? Was it malaria?
Well, not malaria. That was something that the Spanish brought over with them. Of course, they had all these other infectious diseases that they brought along, you know, like measles and smallpox and so forth. But these big waves of epidemics would have been through already before this expedition set off, you know, so I wonder if there was something else. We should ask Delphine, he's the expert. Yeah.
Starvation, I think.
Yeah.
Delphine.
Our guide, Delphine, was a man who knows how to survive in the forest.
4,000 runas.
Indígenas.
¿Es posible en la selva buscar la comida?
I don't think it's possible to find that much food for that many people, because you can't always rely on the jungle to provide you with food or fruit. I think it would be impossible to feed them.
Impossible.
Impossible.
Starvation, yeah. You can imagine, trying to sort of find food in this kind of area for sort of all that huge number of people.
So the 4,000 Indians basically were starved to death.
Yeah, presumably they'd be the bottom of the feeding, the food chain as well, you know, just sort of, and basically left to fend for themselves as things got really tough.
The terrain was terrible, said Pizarro. We had to hack our own path through. And we were worn out already from the crossing of the Andes. Frustrated and angry, Pizarro took it out on his native guides, torturing them, burning them alive, feeding them to his dogs. Not a man to argue with. Food was a growing problem, even for the Spaniards. In the end, says Pizarro, we were forced to eat the buds of a plant like a vine stalk.
Only the little curly bud on the top. See?
That was before they started eating their precious horses. At last, we reached the first landmark described by the Spanish.
Wow.
Hidden behind the falls, legend says, was the gold of the Inca Atahualpa.
¿Qué es detrás las cascadas?
Nosotros creemos como personas naturales.
Those of us who are in touch with nature believe that the spirits exist here.
Existen los espíritus.
Entonces es una puerta del mundo espiritual.
Yes, this is a door to the spiritual world.
Mundo espiritual, sí.
The real story of what's behind the falls, not that it's the gold of Atahualpa as the Spanish believe, but behind there is the entry to the world of the spirits. It's wonderful. Everything the Spanish understand literally, the Indians actually mean metaphorically.
And so we pushed on through thick forest, Pizarro says, hacking with axes and machetes. Often it was impossible to get our horses through.
See what an effort it is just to hack a path through virgin forest. You're lucky if you do a mile or two each day. Just imagine what this was like for hundreds of people and all their baggage and their animals trying to get their way through this. It just doesn't bear thinking about.
At last, after 6 months in the jungle, they emerged from the Andes foothills and saw this view, an immense flat horizon. Even with their limited knowledge, they must have known this stretched all the way to the Atlantic. But how far was that, and what lay in between?
The big stones there. There's a branch under there.
They marched on down the Coca. There were many days, says Pizarro, when we were wading knee-deep, waist-deep, or even worse.
No, it's deep there.
And still no sign of El Dorado. By now, 7 months in, the army was demoralized. Many were too sick to move. Though he hid it from his men, Pizarro was desperate. Orellana now tried to persuade him to turn back, but Pizarro wouldn't give up his quest. He ordered his men to build a boat to carry the sick and wounded and the heavy gear. It took his starving troops a month to make, smelting their horseshoes to forge the nails. But there was an easier way. Using renewable balsa wood, we made a traditional raft with hardwood nails and ropes of bark. With this, we hoped to follow Pizarro down the Coca to the river Napo.
It just goes to show. Spanish went to all that trouble about getting nails, and you only need some hard wood and some soft wood, and you can do it without metal. We'll see if it works. It's our brigantine. I don't think we'll do the full 3,000 miles on that, though. Don't mind.
Pizarro's army set off again on the 9th of November, 1541. Of the beauties of the landscape around them, there's no mention in his account.
And this is what you never read in the history books. You never feel this sense of this immense forest stretching for 2,000 or more miles, this immense blue sky and this great river.
Even with the boat, progress was painfully slow. They could still only go as fast as the army, trudging along the bank. They marched on for 43 days. Christmas came. By now, some of the Spaniards were dying of starvation. Their Christmas was made even more miserable by the news that a vast uninhabited region lay ahead, where no food was to be found. It was Pizarro's nightmare. Mutiny was in the air. And then Orellana stepped forward.
That Christmas, in their camp here by the river, the whole expedition deeply depressed by the struggle of the last 10 months, Orellana came up to Pizarro and said, "Look, give me the brigantine, give me the boat, and a few canoes, some of the men, and I'll go downstream and try and find some food, and I'll come back in 3 or 4 days." And Pizarro looked at him and said, "Whatever you think's best."
Orellana left next day with 57 men. But within days, so he said later, he realized the current was too strong and he couldn't go back. So we chose what seemed to us the lesser of two evils, Orellana said. Trusting to God, we'd go on and follow the river, and either die or see what marvels lay ahead. What he didn't know was that ahead of him was the greatest river on earth. The first few days, they passed through an empty landscape, chewing their boots to stay alive. So close to death, they were hallucinating. Then, on Monday evening, the 8th of January, they heard drums. Orellana landed and nervously went into the forest. They were the first Europeans to walk in the interior of Amazonia.
I think they might be asleep.
I don't think there's anybody home right now. They got their boots. Their boots are here. So they're obviously... Yeah, but it's closed up.
Alin
Maybe out
Punche?
hunting.
Alin Chishi? Nobody here. Well, they did run away when Orellana first landed, left their cooking pots and their food. Orellana's men were starving, so of course they stuffed themselves. The Indians were very nice about it when they came back.
The man's name was Tapui, Nelson Tapui. He farmed here with his family, pretty much cut off from the outside world.
Ah, su mamá. Sí, bien nomás. Sí. Y aquí habíamos conocido.
Sí, mi esposa.
Ah, sí, sí. ¿Usted habla quichua?
Yo sé.
He spoke Quechua, the Inca language.
A ver si le...
Kangi mashuti kangi.
Yeah, Alim. Noka kani Inglaterra, manda.
Nyoka kanye putumayo manda.
Oh, we have to talk slower than that.
Más despacito, dice.
Dios pagarachu.
And language would be the key to Orellana's survival.
Nyoka kanye putumayo manda.
He began to put words down in a notebook.
Yeah, what's the name in Quechua?
La yuca, ¿cómo se dice en quechua?
Lumu.
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 La yuca.
So yucca is lumu. That's a very
The captain made a point to get to understand the native languages, says the diary, and he made his own primer to help him.
So if you ask for good water to drink,
Yaku takuay. Deme agua.
Yaku takui.
Yaku takuay. Para mí.
Takui is give me, yaku is water.
Yeah.
Nelson sent his son up a tree to bring seed pods for us to eat. The native people here were called Imara. They gave Orellana food too. They let the Spaniards stay with them for a month to recover their health, saved them from death.
Pakay.
Pakay. Can I open? Okay. Dios pagarachu. Oh, I can get into these.
Wow.
Delicious.
At this moment, Orellana was still thinking like a conquistador. He told his hosts that he was claiming them and their land for the King of Spain.
Bye-bye.
But maybe a change was beginning to take place in his mind. For kind treatment of the Indians, he said now, was the right way to follow. Over the coming months, Orellana would make contact with many different Indian peoples. Some, like Nelson, would feed and shelter him. Some would try to kill him.
Mum gives us a smile. I think she thought we were aliens at first.
Back upriver, Pizarro was waiting for Orellana to return, his men now dying around him. And as the days turned to weeks, he began to suspect that his loyal cousin might have betrayed him. Orellana's encounter with the Imara had offered hope of survival. Now he and his men decided to get their story straight. They appointed a scribe to put down on paper why they deserted Pizarro. And each and every one of them put his name to it.
We've travelled 200 leagues through savage jungles, they said. We've all seen it with our own eyes. We've felt constant fear of losing our lives because of suffering and hunger. How much more danger and death would there be were we to turn back now? Therefore we all beg you, they say to Orellana, not to ask us to do this. And we ask our scribe to write it down, that we are all willing to follow you by any other route to save our lives, but not to turn back.
But was Orellana being quite truthful? Or did he hope to claim the secret of El Dorado for himself? We continued on his track, down the Coca to its junction with the Napo. Not so long ago, this was just a mission station. Now the town of Francisco Orellana is a Wild West place which has boomed with the opening up of the forest to the new conquistadors, the loggers and the oil men.
Just looking around ourselves, you're seeing the sort of the open sewers and dogs running wild and the terrible overcrowding, and you suddenly understand why it was that diseases evolved in cities where there were huge concentrations of people, rather than in the far healthier lifestyle of the jungle.
And this is, I suppose, the second conquista, isn't it? You know, first they came looking for gold and El Dorado, and now the forests are being plundered. They've had their rubber. And now it's the hardwoods and it's black gold oil.
Yeah. Adios, amigo.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
When you get to Manaus, remember, if you go swimming, don't have a pee.
And so we said our goodbyes to Dr. Colley.
Oh, dear.
Our next leg would take us down the Napo, the Conquistadors' river of cinnamon.
Here's to the river Napo.
Orellana sailed on past other great rivers, the Aguarico, the Curare, down into what is now Peru. We made good speed, says the diary, sometimes more than 20 leagues a day, for the river's flow was swift and strong. Orellana was now on one of the main tributaries of the Amazon, heading east through a vast fluid wilderness. From the air, it's a bewildering maze. Out here, nature seems to have no bounds. Orellana and his men must have gazed on the scene, part in wonder, part in terror. A few days later, they came to a gigantic confluence, the Napo and the Marañón, the beginning of the Amazon proper. And as Orellana reached the Marañón, far to the west, Pizarro had finally given up hope of seeing him again and ordered his men to turn back. There's a shift now in the tone of the expedition diary kept by the priest, Father Carvajal. It may be hindsight, but he seems aware now that the journey was turning into an epic of exploration. It seemed to us, by our continuing survival, that our Lord Jesus was pleased with such a great venture into the unknown. For such a feat of discovery surely might not otherwise have taken place for many centuries into the future.
Muchas gracias. Okay.
Hola.
Okay.
Bienvenida a Orellana.
Oh man, muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
It was here that Orellana first heard strange stories of a fierce tribe of female warriors, like the Amazons of Greek myth. His contemporaries never believed him, but he always swore the tale was true. It's a myth which crops up in many places, and maybe it's not just a myth.
The Spanish say that when they came down the Amazon and there were all these tribes that were ruled by women,
And only when they wanted children did they go and raid and get the men, and then they'd have sex with them, and then they'd get pregnant, and then they'd boot the men out. Are there still... Can you still find women like this on the Amazon?
Dominant. Yes, there are women who are dominant. Of course. Yes, there are women who have power over the men.
Señora Amazonas, déjame surcar tus aguas. Te quiero navegar en tu caudal.
No one knows for sure whether the Amazons really existed, but they gave the river the name it still has today, Rio Amazonas, the river of the Amazons.
Señora Amazona, la naturaleza nos brinda el encanto de nuestro Perú. Tus monarcas, Señor de los ríos, que descubren nevadas sin fin. Señora Amazona, la naturaleza nos brinda el encanto de nuestro Perú.
All the way through what is now Peru, the local people treated these strangers from another world kindly. But did Orellana ever see them as fully human like himself? I think he remained a conquistador. Nonetheless, he was still carefully recording words from the river languages. Next to God, says the diary, the captain's understanding of the native languages was the deciding factor in saving us all from death.
Oh, great. On the Rio Napo.
Rio Napo.
Yeah.
Orellana's diary is the first description of the peoples of Amazonia. This part of the river, he says, they were part of a great federation, the Aparians. In the 2 centuries after the coming of the Spanish, 90% of the population here died from violence and disease. Today, the survivors are people living after a Holocaust. It was a tragedy which went almost unrecorded. Here in Iquitos, Father Joaquin is trying to set the record straight, to recover the lost history of Amazonia.
Hubo un huracán aquí, ¿sí?
Aquí no ha habido huracán. Ayer hubo.
In the 16th century, these were big towns, large and well-organized communities. So maybe what you see now is a distant reminder of what Orellana saw.
I have studied the case of Orellana for a long time, and I've concluded that Orellana met a huge diversity of peoples here. We wondered what happened to all these people. We reckon there were over 6 million in the whole of Amazonia.
The Spaniards were amazed by the natural produce of the forest and the river, the huge quantities of fish of every kind, parrots, turtles as large as leather shields.
Sí, esto es la carachama. Es un pescado prehistórico que sobrevive incluso fuera del agua durante mucho tiempo, ¿no?
Sí.
In his library, Father Joaquin has a copy of the original diary.
Right.
Él es el cronista que acompaña la expedición de Francisco de Orellana.
This is the hand. This is the handwriting of Carvajal.
La letra manual que escribió Fray Gaspar de.
This account was written by Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, a friar of the Order of Dominicans, of the voyage of discovery down the great and famous river.
Que descubrió por muy gran honra el Francisco Orellana.
And I was an eyewitness to these amazing things, says Carvajal, a man whom God chose to play a part in such a strange and hitherto never experienced voyage of discovery.
Okay, this is the next stage of our Amazon journey. The Natalia Carolina says, heading for Caballo Cocha today at 6 o'clock. Por mi madre, sin falta. On my mother, without fail. Oh, about 6:30, isn't it? Wow. This is Amazon time.
Orellana stayed with the Aparians for 2 months to build a second, bigger boat, a 30-footer, a boat strong enough for the sea. When he left, in late April, he still had 2,000 miles of river to go. The dream of El Dorado is distant now. And for me, the voyage had begun to gather like static the history of the intervening 500 years. The later conquistadors, like the demented Aguirre, the so-called wrath of God. The missionaries, the prospectors, and the debt raiders, they all came this way. And the clamor of history rose like the sound of the forest in the night. And in the ghostly shapes we passed, it was easy to imagine the Spaniards on their fragile craft. What hardships, what suffering, and what extraordinary dangers we passed through, wrote Friar Carvajal. He lost an eye in one attack. The people were more hostile now. And as for Orellana, too kind-hearted a soul by far, some said, he had learned to read the signs and to negotiate fear, most of all, perhaps, in himself. They now began to see canoes everywhere. They were approaching even richer lands.
By the middle point of the river, they came past huge settlements extending for many miles without any gaps between the clusters of houses. These were large, well-organized communities with thousands of people, real high cultures.
They were now inside the territory of a huge native federation which stretched for hundreds of miles along the river, the Omagua. They passed so many towns that they could only remember them by giving jokey tags to people and places. Main Street, Chinatown, Viciousville, and Stupidville. So Orellana's diary offers a new history for Amazonia. An elaborate series of ancient kingdoms, networks and alliances which had developed over thousands of years, united by the river itself. After 3 days sailing, we reached the Brazilian frontier. Orellana had to pass a border here too, the frontier of the Machi-Paro state. He had to fight his way through. It's so relaxed today, I couldn't find anyone to stamp my passport.
Imigração? Imigração?
Tem que tomar táxi.
Thanks.
But the spectre of Gonzalo Pizarro still haunted Orellana and his men.
Orellana never forgot the potential cost of crossing Gonzalo Pizarro, member of the most powerful family in the Americas.
Desertion, after all, was punishable by death, and their boyhood friendship would count for very little. So he and his men, all through the journey, covered themselves. This is the second main document that they drew up, formally petitioning Orellana to be their leader, and every single member of the expedition has signed it, with loud protestations of loyalty to the governor Gonzalo Pizarro. But at this moment, they had no idea whether Pizarro was alive or dead.
Pizarro, though, was a man who could face death without flinching. The tale of his hellish return has inspired movies, plays and books ever since. For suffering, famine and misery, wrote one conquistador, this was the worst journey ever in the Indies. Attacked all the way, Pizarro didn't know where he was or what direction to take to reach Peru or any place Christians might be. We ate all our dogs and horses, he wrote, and we got back with only our swords and the rotten rags we stood up in. Pizarro's only thought now was revenge against his boyhood chum, the worst liar that ever there was. And Orellana sailed on, as amazing spectacles of nature came one after the other. In early June, Orellana arrived at the site of Manaus, where the river stretches to the horizon, wide as an inland sea. Manaus was built in the center of the rainforest, founded as a Jesuit mission in the 18th century, when the opening up of Amazonia really started. Where the Opera House and the grand mansions now stand, Orellana saw huge settlements of native people lining the waterfront. There are few places where you feel more strongly the all-consuming march of history. Looking centuries into the future, Orellana's diary says this: "It was our desire that, if possible, the land and its barbaric people should not have negative feelings about our first encounter, so that one day the country might be tamed for pacification and reduced to obedience to our Christian civilization."
The Western conception of a city was a new innovation in the Americas which came with the conquest. They require a new way of life, new laws and customs and institutions to make a new identity, to reshape humanity, if you like. They also suck in the products of the natural world, of the forest and the river, and consume them. And in that, cities like this, Manaus, represent a break in that continuum of thousands of years of life here in the Americas. There may have been 5 million indigenous people here when Orellana came through. The present population of the natives of Amazonia is 250,000, less than a quarter of this city. That's the scale of the revolution.
At last, after 8 months on the river, and against all the odds, in August 1542, Orellana reached the mouth of the Amazon. They had sailed 2,500 miles down the greatest river on earth. They had seen unknown empires and encountered lost worlds. It had been less of a journey, said one of them, more of a miracle. But even as their makeshift boats carried the 47 survivors to safety in the Caribbean, back in Quito, Gonzalo Pizarro was petitioning the king for revenge.
Todos la sabedora tradicional.
Sí. Sí. En Quito, esta es una biblioteca de historia, literatura, medicina.
Pizarro accused Orellana of treason, a crime punishable by death. Captain Orellana paid no heed to the duty that he owed your majesty, and to the well-being of the army and the whole expedition. Instead of bringing us back food, he displayed to us all the greatest cruelty that ever faithless men have shown, and is the worst traitor that ever lived. In his defense, Orellana used the documents that they'd drawn up on the river. Pizarro wasn't telling the truth. What happened was his responsibility. The fact was, we couldn't get back to him. And in the end, it was God's will that we went on to make such amazing discoveries. Pizarro never came home. He died fighting the crown for his family's empire in Peru. Orellana, though, cleared his name and came back to Trujillo. His house is still there, the garden where he and Gonzalo crossed toy swords as boys. He married a wealthy young wife, Ana, but he couldn't settle back in Spain. He petitioned the king to send him back to his river, with the title of Governor of the Amazon. But his luck ran out. The expedition was a disaster.
This is how Anna remembered Orellana's death. My husband couldn't find the main channel of the river, and for 11 months we wandered around like lost people. And in that time we suffered such hardships because of hunger, disease, and the incessant rainfall. We ate all the horses and the dogs, and in the end, almost all the expedition died. My husband among them.